There'll be no more kneeling, no more bowing, no more kneeling after a while, no more weeping, no more crying, no more weeping after a while. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be my Lord, and to go home to be with my Lord and be free.
Program, we have 5 presenters, and I'll just state who they are, and they will present in the order that they're listed on the program. After that, as Dr. Daniels indicated, the commentators on their presentation are going to be ourselves, in addition to the presenters who will comment or tell you the meaning and the significance of their remarks. The first presenter is Howard Dotson from the Schomburg Center for Research, and the topic of his presentation is "What Price Slavery? What Price Freedom?" The second presenter is Gerald Horn from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The topic of his presentation is "Race for Power, Seeking Reparations and the Global Correlation of Forces." Then we will hear from Leslie Tick and Natasha Ray, who are Senior Staff Counsels, State of California Department of Insurance. Their topic is "The Mandate, Senate Bill 2199. And Adjoa Ayatoro, Adjoa. I've rehearsed it and over-rehearsed. I apologize.
That's okay.
And she is the Chair, Legal Strategies Commission, and Chief Counsel, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, and a legal scholar at the American University. And her topic is "Reparations, Repairing the Consequences of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade." We will now hear from Howard Dotson.
Good afternoon. Let me first of all thank the planners for bringing together this event. Thank the state of California for taking the initiative it's taken to raise this discussion, debate to a higher level. I've been involved for the last about 8 years with something called the UNESCO Slave Route Project. And the project was brought together under UNESCO auspices to try to raise consciousness on a global level about the issue of slavery and its centrality in the making of the modern world. Various kinds of activities have taken place across the Atlantic world over the last 8 years. And this program actually brings to ahead, in some respects, the issue that even the UNESCO Slave Route Project has been trying to avoid, which is the issue of reparations. As we were being authorized by UNESCO, we were strongly advised to steer clear of the issue of reparations. Why? I don't know. But the nature of the discourse, especially the public discourse that's been going on over the last few years, certainly leads us inexorably in the direction of reparations. And so I'm delighted to be here to participate on this panel and to just share a few thoughts with you with regard to the whole question of the real theme of this topic, which is the socioeconomic legacy of slavery. And I've chosen as the topic what price slavery, what price freedom. And I don't propose to be the economist that Dick America and Brother Alexis are, and to in any way try to be authoritative with regard to the economic work that has been done and is being done. What I'll be doing is simply stating at the top what some of the foundations for that kind of reparations activity should be, and what I believe are some reasonable ways of thinking about how any funds that are gathered might in fact be used in the final analysis to address the problems that flow from any kind of reparations agenda. I begin by saying that the enslavement of African peoples established the African presence in the Americas, especially in the United States. It also, enslaved African labor also laid the foundations for the formative development of the American national economy. While the first enslaved Africans arrived in the continental limits of today's United States in 1526, slavery developed as a critical aspect of Euro-American colonial economies in North America during the 17th century. Of the 10 to 12 million Africans that survived the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas, only some 500 to 600,000 settled in British North American colonies. By 1860, however, the 500,000 or so involuntary immigrants had grown to some 4 million Africans, almost 4 million Africans in bondage. Most of this growth occurred after the abolition of the slave trade to the United States in 1807, and the population growth paralleled the rise of the slave-based cotton plantation economy in the American South, the foundation of the antebellum American national economy. Efforts to calculate the value of this enslaved African labor in the United States, as well as the social costs of racism and social oppression during and after slavery, have been the foundations on which Black Americans have made or begun to make their reparations claims. And while debates about African Americans' rights to reparations as compensation for the enslavement and racial discrimination they have endured have been constant themes in African American history, such claims, indeed demands, have escalated over the last 3 decades. The purpose of this paper, then, is to review the nature of some of the most recent demands and to suggest alternative strategy for establishing a basis for Black reparations claims and making an appropriate compensation to the African American community. This paper begins with the assumption and understanding that the enslavement of African peoples was, in fact, a global phenomenon impacting African peoples on the continent of Africa as well as throughout the Americas. As such, all African people who were victimized by the slave trade and slavery are entitled to some compensatory reparations. In focusing on the enslaved African experience in the United States, my intention is neither to deny the claims of other descendants of enslaved Africans, nor to separate the African American experience from the plight of other African peoples. Rather, my intention is to explore certain assumptions and principles related to the African Americans in hopes that they might serve as a model or framework for documenting and making similar claims throughout the Atlantic world. In interrogating the U.S. particularity, then, it is my hope that we'll shed some light on the global possibilities. Now, I should begin by saying that in a very real sense, one can never fully repay Africans and their descendants for the losses that were occasioned by the slave trade and slavery. Nor, I'm of the opinion, will we ever be able to fully document the economic consequences of their oppression and exploitation. There is, however, sufficient evidence to document substantial Black reparations claims. And the evidence is so self-evident and it's so compelling that opponents of reparations have begun to try to create what I call ideological constructs that would prevent us from even carrying on a discussion about it, or in some respects, ideological constructs that begin with the assumption that there's no basis for discussion of any kind anyway. The evidence is overwhelmingly compelling. And what I want to say within the context of this forum is that we have to begin with the understanding that the slave trade and slavery itself were first and foremost economic enterprises. From the capture and sale activities that took place along the coast of Africa and that involved the transatlantic slave trade, to the exploitation of slave labor in the Euro-American colonial economies, the slave trade and slavery were concerned first and foremost with the profit that could be achieved by buying and selling and exploiting the relationships and economic activities of the enslaved population. Those who were involved in it were involved in the returns that they could gather on their investments. Because so many of the transactions involved in developing enslaved African labor forces and exploiting them for profit, extensive records exist for documenting the economic foundations of African Americans' reparations claims. The insurance records that have been the catalyst for today's session are certainly important in documenting the involvement of this particular sector of the American industry in the functioning of slave labor systems in the Americas. But beyond the insurance company records, there's also extensive documentation on virtually every aspect of the slavery and slave making and slave exploitation experience, because it was economic activity. And if you've had any experience dealing with the records, they're quite extensive, ranging from that extraordinary database that's been put together, some, I believe, documentation of some 27,000 of the 50,000 estimated ships that were involved in the slave trade, extensive documentation of the actual economic activity that was involved there. Beyond that, everything from the purchase of the enslaved Africans once they arrive on these shores, the purchase and trade in Africans during the domestic slave trade, the nature of the slave-produced products and the value that they represented to the American economy. All of these things are extensively documented in the existing literature, and we don't stop there. The finance industry of New York and other parts of the country integrally entwined in the whole slave trade and slavery experience, so much so that in the city of New York, when South Carolina decided to secede, the mayor of the city of New York proposed to the city council of New York that the city of New York secede from the Union as well, because of the intricate nature of their relationship to slavery and the slave trading system. The shipping industry itself, every facet of American society during this formative period of its development is intricately related to this phenomenon of the slave trade. So the documentation of the exploitation, domination, and the economic consequences of that is quite extensive and needs no, I'd say, further comment. What I'm proposing to do here is to ask that the economists continue their work using these resources and others to try to develop the foundations of that claim. But I wanted to, before going on, just remind ourselves that the modern reparations movement among Black Americans have undoubtedly been inspired in no small measure by the successful reparations struggles waged by other oppressed groups in American and world society since 1945. Foremost among these have been the widely publicized reparations payment made to individual Jews and the State of Israel over the last half century in compensation for the exigencies of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. I believe the payments now add up to something over $8 billion to individuals and several billion to Israel itself to date. Another $600 million was, I believe, paid in the year 2000. And this is independent of the Holocaust-inspired aid payments made by the United States and other European powers annually. Still other reparations claims have been successfully pursued to gain compensation for lost or compensated property, including gold deposited in European banks and other such things. Japanese Americans who were rounded up and imprisoned after Pearl Harbor recently were awarded reparations payments as well. The United States initially paid $20,000 per person. That was in 1992. But the U.S. Office of Reparations agreed to increase the amounts to the Anisi and their descendants beyond the original $1.25 billion that had been allocated for it. The U.S. government has made reparations payments to Native Americans who have suffered various injustices over the years. Native Americans of Alaska, for instance, were awarded $1 billion and 4.4 million acres in response to their reparations claim. The Sioux of South Dakota, 105 million. The Klamaths of Oregon, 81 million. The Ottawas of Michigan, 23 million. The Chippewas of Wisconsin, 31 million. And the Florida descendants of the Seminoles, 12.3 million. These successful reparations cases have established the fact that the United States government itself recognizes the principle of reparations as a means of making amends for past wrongful deeds. For some strange reason, which I can't quite figure out, whenever black people start raising this question, they begin with the assumption that they're undeserved. Black Americans pursuing reparations claims as compensation for crimes associated with the capture and enslavement of their ancestors and the economic consequences of racism has escalated over the last 30 years or so. The Republic of New Africa brought $40 billion in reparations as part of its effort to establish sought $400 billion in reparations as part of its effort to establish an independent black republic in 5 southern states. Founded in Detroit in 1968, the RNA under the leadership of Imari Obadeli has been a consistent proponent of reparations in the United States. James Foreman's Black Manifesto of 1969 proposed a modest $5 billion reparations demand from white Christian churches and Jewish synagogues. And the Los Angeles Coalition Cosmopolitan Brotherhood Association has called for the indemnification of descendants of enslaved Africans. And U.S. Congressman Conyers has drafted a reparations bill for the U.S. House of Congress and House of Representatives, and the National Coalition of Black Reparations Associations in COBRA has been coordinating initiatives and strategies, and you'll hear more from them as later today. As of today, 2 lawsuits have been filed. The most recent one filed in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey, in federal court, seeking reparations in behalf of African Americans for the involvement of several corporations, including New York Life Insurance Company and others, in the slave trade and slavery. As most of you know, African people's demand for reparations rests on 3 basic propositions. First, that the mass killing, kidnap, sale, and enslavement of Africans from the 16th through the 19th century was one of the most wicked criminal enterprises in recorded human history. Second, that no adequate compensation has ever been paid by the perpetrators or their descendants to the sufferers and their descendants. And third, that the consequences of the crime continue to enrich the descendants of the perpetrators and impoverish and underdevelop Africa, Africans, and descendants of Africa in the diaspora. Arguments in support of African people's claims for reparations have rested on moral, cultural, legal, and economic grounds. And while I believe, as I've stated earlier, that the economic basis for reparations it clearly exists and can be documented fully in the available scholarship that we have, I believe that the assertion that the trade in and exploitation of enslaved African peoples and their consequences constitute an international law, a crime against humanity, and as such must rest on solid legal foundations. Lord Anthony Guilford, British Queen's Counsel and a Jamaican attorney at law, has maintained that international law recognizes that those who commit crimes against humanity must make reparation. In a paper that he presented to the first Pan-African Congress of Reparations held in 1993 in Abuja, Nigeria, Lord Gifford noted that the charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal defined crimes against humanity thusly, quotes, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country were perpetrated. And that last part is very important, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country were perpetrated. This charter also maintained that the violation of laws and customs of war, including murder, ill treatment, or deportation to slave labor, or any other purpose of the civilian population of or in an occupied territory, also constituted a crime against humanity. International law has also recognized that those who commit crimes against humanity must make, are required by law to make reparations. And according to the Permanent Court of International Justice, the predecessor of the International Court of Justice, we find that reparation must, as far as possible, wipe out all the consequences, and I underline my emphasis, wipe out all the consequences of the illegal act and reestablish the situation which would, in all probability, have existed if the act had not been committed. Restitution in kind, or, if this is not possible, payment of a sum corresponding to the value which a restoration in kind would bear. The court defined reparation as the award, if need be, of damages for loss in kind or payment in the place of it. And in determining or trying to assess the amount of compensation due African peoples for acts contrary to international law, I believe these principles should guide their determination. Numerous cases of international law can be cited to demonstrate that peoples throughout the world have been compensated for crimes against humanity far less heinous and enduring than the centuries-long enslavement of African peoples. To date, however, African peoples' just claims have not been compensated. What I propose to do in the last 2 minutes is just say a couple of things about alternatives or remedies. If we agree with the concept of international law that some form of restitution must be made, and the attempt should be to bring people back to the condition that would have existed if the act had not been committed, then it seems to me that the only way to approach dealing with the question of how to properly compensate the black community or the African American community is to come up with some program that approaches the subject in terms of the community's development as a whole. What I've suggested is something I'm calling a generational approach to reparations. And very briefly, what it says is that for the next 40 years, funds accumulate, well, that we have over the course of the years, both as a consequence of slavery and of the racial discrimination, accumulated something that we can call a social bank account. What I call that social bank account, and it's not my term, it's come from another scholar working in this field. That social bank account is the accumulated wealth or value of wealth produced by African Americans in the American economy, both during the period of slavery and as a consequence of this the racism that has happened since then, or discrimination that's happened since then. I'm suggesting that this social bank account, which is basically funds that have been earned by the African American community or have come as a result of their the racial discrimination meted out against them. I'm suggesting that this be used to set up a series of black equity funds sufficient to establish the economic basis for beginning to compensate the African American sufferers. And I'm suggesting that this fund be used to ensure that every African American child born in the next 40 years be guaranteed food, clothing, and shelter, and access to publicly supported education through this fund. Second, ensure that every African American interested in creating a business over the next 40 years have access to venture capital funds to help finance the development of these new businesses. And third, to ensure that over the next 40 years, every African American seeking to own a home have access to a home ownership fund to acquire such residential property. And fourth, that investments be used to expand the educational system, especially urban school systems and HBCUs, to ensure that the American educational system is capable of accommodating these expanded African American educational enrollments. Let me remind you that this is not and should not be seen as a program of government welfare or largesse. The value of the nation's social bank account is in fact black equity in the American national economy, a product of the labor and exploitation of black Americans. Various black equity funds to be established in this account derive from black labor and blacks' economic presence. Charges against these funds for the purposes described above are charges against black Americans' historic accumulation of capital in the American economy, which I consider an appropriate way of beginning to address the reparations payments scheme. I thank you and will be glad to answer any questions you might have at the conclusion.
Thank you, Dr. Dotson. Our next speaker is Gerald Horn from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. The executive summary or action recommendation of my 20 minutes can be summed up in these few sentences. Just like those seeking reparations for Holocaust victims in Europe often brought suit in the United States and waged struggle in the United States, a viable, successful reparations struggle in the United States must consider waging struggle in Europe and bringing suit in Brussels and perhaps South Africa and perhaps China, India, Brazil, etc. And that this should be done with multiple plaintiffs, including possibly the lineal descendant of the Organization of African Unity, the African Union, various Native American groupings, which, as you know, are very influential in Sacramento, amongst other places. In the time remaining, I'll seek to present or sketch a broad global survey of historical and contemporary pressure points that can be pushed on the behalf of the reparations struggle. In other words, a political come legal strategy. According to certain polls, something like 75% of those in the United States are opposed to reparations, for African Americans in particular. This should not be deemed surprising in a nation with a majority that has been birthed and suckled on the notion that blacks receive, quote, preferential treatment, unquote, via affirmative action programs that in truth, of course, mostly benefit Euro-American women. Yet stating this bald fact both presents a dilemma and a historical perspective for examining this all-important question of reparations. The dilemma is simple. How does one obtain an objective that an overwhelming majority may not support? But the historical perspective provides an answer to this otherwise nettlesome dilemma. Consider that if a plebiscite had been held in the Deep South on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it is possible that the majority that had the right to vote would have voted against that as well. The secret to whatever African American advance that has occurred in this nation has been support from the international community that has then compelled the majority in the United States to do the right thing. Historians now acknowledge, for example, that the Cold War had everything to do with the erosion of Jim Crow in the 1950s and the 1960s. How could Washington credibly charge Moscow with human rights violations, pose as a paragon of human rights virtue, and win hearts and minds amongst colored peoples globally as long as peoples of color in this nation were treated so atrociously? Jim Crow had to go, and those who objected to this epical transition were dragged to an accommodation, scratching and flailing all the while by the force of the international community. Consequently, the proposition that a majority of those in the United States may oppose reparations should not detain or derail us. To the contrary, it should cause us to heighten our lobbying efforts within the constituency that ultimately matters, the international community. It was decades ago that W.E.B. Du Bois reminded us that, quote, the Negro problem in America is but a local phase of a world problem, unquote. This remains true, but too often of late, many of us, perhaps intoxicated with our recently proclaimed citizenship rights, have acted as if this was solely a local problem that we face here, only worth ventilating in domestic circles. But this approach has not worked for some time now, has reached a point of virtual exhaustion, and minimally should be subjected to severe reconsideration. Those who may have doubts about this thesis should do no more than examine the movement against the death penalty. Majorities have been registered for years in favor of this draconian measure, though routinely African Americans are the disproportionate victim of this policy. despite the suggestion that those who kill blacks are less likely to get the death penalty, which means our lives are worth less than those of others. Evidentiary of the bipartisan support for the death penalty is the fact that both the Democratic and Republican presidential standard bearers in 2000 both supported execution as the price for committing certain crimes. Yet as international condemnation of the death penalty mounts, often generated by domestic constituencies, including this international protest, including fervent protests from the likes of Germany and the European Union, it is apparent that second thoughts about this measure are growing. This helps to explain why former Black Panther Mumia Abu-Jamal has yet to be executed and why a death penalty moratorium was called by a Republican governor in Illinois. In any event, as well, we begin to look abroad for just as contradictions between Washington and Moscow, creating an opening for the emergence of a movement against Jim Crow, similar contradictions between the United States and its growing list of opponents worldwide may do the same for the movement in favor of reparations. There is some evidence to suggest that it might be possible to take advantage of the emerging contradictions between the European Union and the United States, for example. Some time ago, it was reported that certain EU nations, leading members of which were prominent in the slave trade, may be open to heeding a call for reparations from the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States, but less enthusiastic about reparations to African nations, which would have to come from the coffers of such as London, Paris, The Hague, Lisbon, Brussels in the first place. Of course, it would be unwise for the reparations movement to selfishly and incorrectly opt for reparations in the Western Hemisphere while leaving the African continent to fend for itself. On the other hand, it would be quite appropriate to take advantage of emerging tensions between the two major forces, or two of the major forces in the global economy, the EU and the United States, on the behalf of the reparations movement. And I might add that this fall, the EU and a group of reparations activists in Chicago are sponsoring a conference that will be well worth attending. Certainly it appears that the United States government is seeking to leverage elements of the international community against the reparations movement. Thus, it has been reported that U.S. protests about condemning Zionism and/or Israel at the United Nations-sponsored World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa during the summer of 2001 may have had motives that were less than transparent. As one usually well-informed journal put it, quote, "Some believe the United States' action regarding Israel is a convenient way for Washington to prevent discussion of the slavery issue, which could have deep political and financial implications," unquote. A leading diplomat affirmed this hypothesis in declaring, quote, "For the United States, slavery is more important and Israel is a smokescreen," unquote. Thus, although sectors of the reparation movement may have forgotten about the international community has not forgotten about the reparations movement, thankfully. Hence, the question becomes not whether the reparations movement should survey the international communities for openings and leverage, but how to go about it. A useful first step in that regard is to examine what used to be called the global correlation of forces or the balance of power globally in order to ascertain what are the pressure points to be probed. As the comment above suggested, it would be a mistake to assume that there are no differences between and amongst the member states of the EU and the United States. A quick perusal of the 20th century finds the United States has waged war on a number of EU states more than once, principally Germany, the locomotive of this developing superstate. Though France has been allied with the United States in major wars, it is important to note that Paris has been a moving force behind the euro, the common European currency, which bids fair to challenge, if not replace, the dollar, which could have disastrous impact on the United States economy. Of course, the euro has been rising against the dollar, as you might have noted, in currency markets in past days. That is not all. Raging disputes between Washington and Brussels, capital of the European Union, continues to boil on matters as disparate as beef, barley, cinema, aerospace, and more. Thus, Airbus, the European plane manufacturer, has been challenging Boeing, particularly in the lucrative realm of constructing jumbo jets, which are worth tens of millions of dollars. France, along with a number of other EU member states, is irate about the fact that Hollywood has both invaded the French and European market while successfully throwing up barriers to curb the influx of their films into the United States. Indeed, in the wake of the tragic events of September 11, 2001, it's evident that in the long term, it is possible that the value of the dollar will fall, although the idea of the United States as a safe haven is still a relevant one and has not sunk totally under the rubble of the World Trade Center. And the value of the euro possibly may rise, by increasing EU influence. The increased U.S. reliance on the EU and indeed the international community to help in its war against, quote, terrorism, unquote, Also suggests that Washington will become more reliant on the world and thus may have to heed clarion calls coming from abroad. And I think the whole Middle East crisis can be looked at through that prism, and perhaps that can be discussed during our discussion. The position of Germany in this context is striking. Compared to Britain and France, Germany was not a major colonial power in Africa or elsewhere. Indeed, one of the major causes of the two bloodlettings called World War I and World War II was Berlin's effort to gain a larger share of the division of the world that would be more in line with what its ruling elite saw as the nation's actual power. The end result was that Germany wound up losing what colonies it's had, particularly in Namibia, Southwest Africa, which after Berlin's ignominious defeat in World War I was handed over to South Africa. Interestingly, though the World Congress Against Racism in Durban was boycotted by most high-level representatives of North America and Western Europe, Germany dispatched its foreign minister who expressed contrition for slavery and colonialism. 10 minutes? Okay. The foreign minister of Germany is a member of the Green Party, a party not unlike the party of the same name, represented by the much reviled Ralph Nader during the 2000 presidential race, and the Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, facing election in a few months, is a social democrat. Many in Europe look askance at the United States and its cowboy capitalism that Washington has sought to foist on the rest of the planet by dint of its leading role in multilateral institutions such as the World Bank, led by the Australian-American James Wolfensohn, and the International Monetary Fund. Many Europeans look down their nose at George Bush, present occupant of the White House, as a Bible-quoting, gun-toting, abortion-obsessed, environment-polluting, toxic Texan. They resent his seeking to gut international treaties on global warming, small arms, the International Criminal Court, etc. Just as there are those in Washington who no doubt find it convenient to have leverage against Germany and Switzerland because of Holocaust lawsuits, there are those in Europe who would like to have leverage against the United States because of reparations claims. Indeed, those seeking to file reparations claims in the United States would also be well advised to look into the possibility of filing such claims in European courts and other courts that I've already made reference to. Just as those non-governmental organizations seeking leverage in this fight should be also looking across the Atlantic. It's no accident that it's the state of California's legislature that's helping to propel us forward today, and not the state of North Carolina legislature, for example, or the state of Virginia legislature. And if you can understand why in Germany one of the most popular writers is Karl May, who writes voluminously romanticizing Native Americans, and why in the United States you're more likely to encounter Holocaust memorials than you are in Germany, then you'll be able to understand some of the impetus behind the strategy I'm suggesting. The Prime Minister, the outgoing Prime Minister of France, Lionel Jospin, is not only a socialist but a former Trotskyite. Interestingly, he recently endorsed the potentially far-reaching Tobin tax, named after late Yale professor James Tobin, which in various permutations would place a tax on cross-border capital movements, stock transactions, the funds from which could then be deployed on behalf of the developing world, and/or reparations claims. I would suggest that demand be put to the anti-corporate-led globalization movement, which is pushing in the name of millions on behalf of the Tobin tax. Thus far, President Fidel Castro of Cuba, another prominent defender of reparations, has been one of the few international leaders bold enough to endorse this measure. The Prime Minister, that Jospin, that the Prime Minister of France would do so is indicative of how quickly political currents can shift, something reparations advocates should keep in mind. Similarly, at the Durban conference, the French Minister of Cooperations, Charles Josselin, declared, quote, "The French Parliament has unanimously adopted a law recognizing that slavery, the transatlantic slave trade perpetrated from the 15th century against Africans, Amerindians, Malagasys, and Indians constitutes a crime against humanity," unquote. One awaits a similar declaration from the US Congress or the Bush administration. In the meantime, it would be quite useful for advocates of reparations to establish firm linkages with the so-called anti-corporate-led globalization movement, which has shaken the foundations of the leading powers from Seattle to Quebec City to Prague to Genoa. One idea that reparations advocates could usefully bring to anti-globalization circles is that the idea that protecting sovereignty, particularly US sovereignty, is not necessarily and always a value worth defending. As noted here, often it has been necessary to override US sovereignty, such as to protect the human rights of peoples of color, particularly African Americans. In fact, this notion that anti-globalization means upholding US sovereignty is possibly one reason why participation of peoples of color in the massive anti-globalization marches have not been up to par. In any case, the reparations movement must engage with the European Union in order to advance its worthy goals. Keep in mind that a number of leading members of the EU were neither slave-trading nations nor colonial powers. The Scandinavian nations, whose foreign aid to Africa is proportionally higher than that of the United States, come quickly to mind. Social democrats, too, play a leading role in this region, and just as the communists in the United States have special ties to ruling communists in Cuba and Vietnam, the Democratic Socialists of America, which has included former Congressman Ronald V. Dellum amongst its leaders, has special ties to European social democrats that are well worth exploring. In that regard, reparations advocates should not only pursue such ties, but should also move forthwith to dispatch delegations to leading EU capitals to engage in extensive discussions with political parties and other organs of civil society. Now, the rest of this paper talks about this same sort of strategy applied to different parts of the world: Japan, China, Africa, the Arab world, etc. So keep that in mind as I go forward. Although, because I might not be able to get into all of that right now, it can come up in questions and answers in my next 5 minutes. This is nothing new. During the era of slavery, Frederick Douglass spent a considerable amount of time touring Europe, drumming up opposition against the lords of the lash, the demon slave owners of the South. That Britain did not intervene on behalf of the South during the U.S. Civil War, though breaking up and weakening the United States had been a long-term goal of London, at least since the War of 1812, did not occur, not least because of the influence wielded in the UK by lobbyists like Douglass. Likewise, a turning point for the crusade against lynching, spearheaded by Ida B. Wells Barnett, took place when she toured Europe, bringing to the attention of a larger audience the heinous extrajudicial crimes then being perpetrated against mostly African Americans. Thus, there is ample precedent for such delegations, or alternatively opening an office in the EU capital, Brussels. Needless to say, reparations advocates should not limit our lobbying to the EU alone. As of now, relations between the United States and the world's second leading economy, Japan, appear to be quite close. Right now, Washington, after helping to send the Soviet Union to oblivion after the expenditure of trillions of dollars in taxpayers' money, is eyeing hungrily the prospect of destabilizing the Communist Party of China with the assistance of Tokyo, Taiwan, etc. As will be noted below, the United States ruling elite is not united on the question of China, not least because of the massive investment there by such giants as General Motors, Kodak, Microsoft, etc. Still surrounding China by dint of alliances with Australia, India, and if they will cooperate, Vietnam and South Korea is high on the agenda of the Bush White House, and Japan is seen as a keystone in this arch of containment. So then the paper goes on to talk about possibly actions by reparations advocates in Asia. But let me conclude by turning to Mexico, appropriate given that we're standing on soil that formerly was part of Mexico. The same holds true for Mexico, the largest Spanish-speaking nation in the world, and by some estimates, the 10th largest economy in the world. The abject importance of Mexico is one reason why the 2001 election in the city of Los Angeles was of such concern to many reparations advocates. There, African Americans voted overwhelmingly for Jim Hahn, a staid Euro-American candidate, against a progressive Mexican-American candidate who formerly was a union organizer, the charismatic Antonio Villaraigosa. African Americans were joined in this effort by the most conservative forces in the city. One of the first times such a black conservative alliance has been forged. That the winning campaign also employed offensive white supremacist stereotypes directed at Villaraigosa makes this development even more troubling. That African American leadership has now turned on Hahn in the wake of his support for the dismissal of Police Chief Bernard Parks, a leading black official in that city, only suggests the bankruptcy of the 2001 mayoral strategy. But is even more troubling from the point of view of the reparations movement. This movement will require allies in the international community, particularly the polls showing that 75% of the population of this nation is opposed to reparations as of now. Mexico, which has maintained sound ties with Cuba since the revolution, although of course Fox is trying to mess with that, and influences profoundly every Latin American nation, cannot be ignored, and in fact must be courted assiduously if the reparations movement is to gain friends in the international community. Mexico, by some estimates, has the 10th largest economy in the world, and productive forces will only be growing more dramatically there in coming years, and this nation must be courted for an effective global reparations campaign. The case of Mexico also points up the advantage of a global strategy. As the Bush administration and the center-right consensus that he represents becomes more and more unpopular in the international community, it becomes even more important for reparations advocates to reach out abroad and distinguish ourselves sharply from the government that purports to represent us. Doing so becomes problematic when African Americans are voting in lockstep with conservatives in Los Angeles. How much time left? Okay. Okay, I'll conclude by saying a few notes about Caribbean and Africa. Since the days of Marcus Garvey, the voice of Jamaica in particular has been critical in the Pan-African movement. This remains true today as the noted Jamaican diplomat Dudley Thompson played a pivotal role at the Durban Conference. But for all of the historic importance of the Caribbean, it is appropriate to conclude with the key region that must be courted if reparations is to become a reality. Africa's support for reparations should not be taken for granted, as the example of the Senegalese leadership, which has expressed extreme skepticism about reparations, suggests. There are three key nations on the continent, and fortunately all should be supportive to a greater or lesser degree: South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt. Cairo will be critical in this regard, for despite our common stances concerning our parallel stances concerning reparations, this North African nation is justifiably skeptical about the position of African Americans concerning a matter dear to their heart, the question of Israel's illegal occupation and settlements in Palestine. Pay attention to the vote in the US Congress yesterday on this, as a matter of fact. Other than the United States and Israel, the international community should be united, or is united, excuse me, in opposition to occupation and settlements, and if African Americans think they can obtain reparations while remaining silent or worse, supportive of Israel's illegalities, they are dreaming in Never Never Land. Joining the international community on settlements and occupations also would garner the reparations movement a friendly audience in the region from Egypt to Iran, and possibly Indonesia and Malaysia as well, the latter two being similarly important, predominantly Islamic nations. In short, the reparations movement must not stop trying to gain support here at home. To do otherwise would be foolish. Yet it would be equally misguided to think that reparations can be obtained absent massive support from the international community. The domestic struggle is already presumed. It is the global struggle that must be engaged if we are to overcome. Thank you.
Our next presenters, thank you, Dr. Horn. Our next presenters are Leslie Tick and Natasha Ray.
Good afternoon. I'm Natasha Ray, my colleague, Leslie Tick, and as I was sitting in the audience, taking in all of the fantastic depth and breadth of scholarship that you've shown here at Santa Barbara, I was thinking, why are we here? After all, we are bureaucrats, let's just come out with it, from Department of Insurance. And as I started thinking about why we are here, it occurred to me that unless we know where we've been, we can't hope to figure out why we are here, who we are, or where we're going. And to that end, I started thinking about where we have been in the course of the conference. And of course, we started out with a global orientation to the transatlantic slave trade. And from there, we have proceeded through the Caribbean, Latin America, colonial and antebellum North America, Brazil, and the modern American economy. So where are we now? Well, in point of fact, we are in California, where in 2000, the governor signed a bill that was proposed by then Senator Tom Hayden, Democrat of Santa Monica, that proposed to gather some information regarding the economic legacy of slavery and the impact of that legacy on California. So what we're going to do is describe the legislation and the attendant regulations that were proposed and implemented by the department. And then Ms. Tick is going to talk about what it is we received in the wake of all of that very hard work. Senate Bill 2199, Slavery-Era Insurance Policies, contains legislative findings that, in addition to some other observations, notes that insurance policies from the slavery era have been discovered in the archives of several insurance companies documenting insurance coverage for slaveholders for damage to or death of their slaves issued by a predecessor insurance firm. These documents provide the first evidence of ill-gotten profits from slavery, which profits in part capitalized insurers whose successors remain in existence today. And then the legislative findings go on to state that the people of California are entitled to significant historical information of this nature. And the actual provisions of the statute as passed calls for the insurance commissioner to request and obtain information from insurers licensed in doing business in the state regarding any records of slaveholder insurance policies issued by any predecessor corporation during the slavery era. The statute goes on to state that the commissioner shall obtain the names of slaves and names of slaveholders, and that information shall be made available to the public and to the legislature, that this information shall be gathered from each insurer licensed and doing business in the state, and finally, that descendants of slaves whose ancestors were defined as private property, dehumanized, divided from their families, forced to perform labor without appropriate compensation or benefits, and whose ancestors' owners were compensated for damages by insurers are entitled to full disclosure. The companion statute to Senate Bill 2199 was Senate Bill 1737, which entitled Economic Legacy of Slavery in California, which is the legislation that requested that the regents of the UC host a colloquium of scholars to draft a research proposal to analyze the economic benefits of slavery that accrued to owners and the businesses, including insurance companies and their subsidiaries that received those benefits. The colloquium shall draw on the resources and knowledge of historians and other scholars from across the nation, as well as California, and interested parties shall also be invited to participate. What we did in order to carry out our portion of the legislation, SB 2199, was we drafted and implemented regulations that were designed to let insurance companies know how they were to go about complying with the statute. Toward that end, we sent out a notice on January 3rd, 2001, which was the first business day after the effective date of the statute. We sent out notices to insurance carriers that may have been subject to the law. There were a couple of lines of insurance that that would be excluded, title insurance, for instance. So we targeted life insurance companies and property and casualty carriers. The P&C carriers generally are going to write marine insurance or some ancestor of the type of insurance that was written during the slavery era. So that's what we were looking for. We then initiated a rulemaking process, which we're required to do pursuant to California law whenever we propose and implement a regulation. As part of that process, we issued a public notice on January 26th, 2001, indicating that public hearings would be held in Los Angeles and San Francisco. We had those on March 13th and 16th, 2001, respectively, and that the purpose of the public hearings would be to gather comments on the proposed regulations. The rulemaking process consisted of the initial notice, the text of the regulation, as well as the hearings and the public comments that were gathered at the hearing, as well as public comments that we received in writing from interested parties. We, as part of our implementation of the statute, determined, researching our own internal archives, that there were there were 18 insurance companies that were writing in California in 1868, which was the year that the Department of Insurance was established and the first year that we had a commissioner of insurance. So we looked back at those records and determined that out of all of the carriers that were writing at that time, there were 18 remaining that still had some kind of existing modern entity. So we sent a special invitation to come to the hearing to those 18, thinking that, they might have something of particular interest to say, since they were modern entities. We got 18 polite responses saying thanks very much, but we declined to attend. We will await the implementation of the regulations. We held the public hearings in Los Angeles and San Francisco. We had quite a nice turnout in LA. I would have to say. A little bit less so in San Francisco, but that's just sort of a function of the demographics, I think. We compiled all of the public comments. We made a few minor changes to the regulations based on the public comments, and we submitted them to the Office of Administrative Law, which is a state agency that oversees the implementation of all state agency regulations. The regulations were ultimately approved on September 6th in 2001, and they were effective October 13th, 2001, and carriers were to submit data by December 14th, 2001. And we have subsequently received some information pursuant to the regulation from the carriers. Oh, I did want to talk about the methodology before we go on. Part of the regulations requires that carriers let us know. It's a research methodology requirement that's designed to have carriers tell us how it is they went about looking for the information that they sent. The regulation specifies that with respect to research conducted to determine whether or not carriers have any records within their possession or knowledge relating to insurance policies issued to slave holders, that carriers are to provide a description of the methods employed by the insurer to identify and compile the records. Essentially, how is it that you determined where you were going to look and what you were going to look for? And the regulation also provides that we should, that the carrier will give us a description of the research that was conducted at the insurer's own facility, as well as a description of research conducted at other facilities known to the insurer, if any. And that if the insurer had found no data that was responsive to the statute, that they should state that. And I will let Ms. Tick continue on and let you know what it is we received.
As Natasha said, we sent out a notice to all the life and P&C carriers. The notice went out to about 1,300 companies. We've gotten almost 100% compliance. We're still following up with several other companies. Overwhelmingly, the companies responded by saying they didn't do business prior to 1865. That's how we defined the slavery era, prior to 1865. Overwhelmingly, they wrote back and said neither they nor any predecessor that they knew of did business prior to 1865. So that's the vast majority of responses. And we've been pretty good about following up with them, even about how they know that, making sure we have a description of the research they did so that a company just can't say, doesn't apply to me. We need a substantive response. So of the 1,300, about 8 companies actually sent us documents, which surprised me. I think it surprised everybody that we actually got as much as we did. Of the 8 responses, of the 8 companies with documents, 3 companies had names of slaves and names of slaveholders, which comes to about 600 names of slaves and about 400 names of slaveholders. All this is in our report, by the way, which came out May 1st, which I think there are copies of in the lobby. If there aren't copies, it's on our website, www.insurance.ca.gov. There's a substantive description of the responses from the 8 companies, and there's the database with the names of the slaves and the names of the slaveholders. Also, all the responses we got, all 1,300 or so reports that we received, are available at the public viewing rooms that the department keeps in Los Angeles and in San Francisco, because these are all public. Natasha mentioned those 18 companies got the special invitation letter. We've gotten 100% compliance from those 18 companies, which is significant because those are the companies that we know of that were really in business then and are still in business now. Of those companies, 2 of them said, "You've got the wrong company. We had nothing to do with any of this. Keep looking." But most of them said, yes, we did business during the slavery era, but we don't have any records that would indicate that we wrote slave insurance. One company told us that they had a big fire in the late 1800s, so all their records could have disappeared. Well, it's possible that that happened. It's entirely conceivable. These are very old records. So, of the companies that responded, I brought 2 policies to show what some of these policies look like. I don't even know how that machine works. I think you just lay it down. You have to open up these things. And that's the, no, that's right. That's the Nautilus policy. The Nautilus policies were provided by New York Life Insurance, which provided the vast majority of the names. You can see this is a policy for a $5 premium. It would pay out $412. It's a policy for a period of 1 year, starting in February 1847. And it says, I don't know if you can read it, about halfway down, with permission to be employed in the, and personally I can't read the rest of it. We've seen several policies like this. It's pretty unusual to have a life insurance policy for a term of 1 year. And it seems that most of the documents we collected were for short terms, and which leads us to believe that, although it's really up to you scholars to read all this and figure out what it all means and what's in it, but leads me to believe that these were really for the lives of slaves that were leased out for ultra-hazardous activity, either building railroad or mining activities, that I don't think plantation owners routinely insured all the slaves who worked on the farm. I think they were insured for short periods of time when they were leased out, because apparently slaves were leased out. Here's another one. Similar, this is Aetna. Again, a 12-month term, this one beginning in November 1857, $67 premium, quite a bit higher than the last one, but this one pays out $2,700. This may have been on, I believe this was on several slaves, because Aetna told us that they wrote their policies on groups of people and that there would be an attached list. So in any event, just to run down the documents that we received, Aetna sent us about 7 policies and some names, and then about a month later said, we don't want you to think we didn't search very hard, but we just found some more stuff. And they sent that to us as well. A company called ACE sent us an Aetna policy, which they're not sure why they have an Aetna policy, but they did, and they sent it to us. AIG acquired another company which used to be called U.S. Life Insurance Company of the City of New York. They sent us some U.S. life policies and a very interesting article which is excerpted in great depth in our report about the practice of insuring slaves. And according to this article, I think somebody mentioned before insuring runaways. This article says that the policies routinely excluded coverage for death by riot, insurrection, suicide, or by the hands of justice. So that would be excluded, according to this article. Then New York Life sent us the names of about 400 slaves and about 200 slaveholders, all of those written by Nautilus. And they were sold from 1845 to 1848, and then the company voted to stop writing slave insurance. They claim that they paid out more in death claims than they received in premium. Another company, Penn Mutual, told us that they found handwritten documents, I think it's about 4 pages of handwritten documents, that say slavery insurance at the top and then have a whole bunch of figures. They have no idea whether they come from their company or anybody else. So it seems that the companies were pretty good about giving us everything they had. A company called Royal and Son Alliance sent us extensive, again, they're extensively quoted in the report, excerpts from a corporate history written in 1949 about the slave practices, the slave insurance practices of a British affiliate of theirs, which technically is not even covered, but we were very happy to get that information. Which again, now this one talks about insuring slaves as cargo between Africa and the continental United States. And according to this article, the question is raised whether the policies would cover damages to the boat and damages to the slaves, loss of the slave lives because of insurrection. And this article says, yes, the policies would cover that kind of damage. So we don't really know what the answer is. Then a company called Manhattan Life sent us a speech made in 1961 having to do with insuring Chinese coolie labor coming from Panama, coming from China either to Panama or to Oregon, depending upon which of the documents you read. Those policies required that a doctor be on board to make sure that the cargo was being properly fed. And then Providence, Washington, we included because they sent us board of directors, minutes of a board of directors meeting where they affirmatively voted to not write slave insurance and to never write slave insurance. And that's an interesting document to look at because it kind of goes through the history of slave law in Rhode Island. So the documents that we got are described in the report, and they're all available at the public viewing rooms. The addresses and the phone numbers of the public viewing rooms are noted on the website and in the report. Also, the department is preparing several other sets of all these responses to donate to UCSB, to give to UCSB for the library or for the Department of Black Studies, whoever decides where that goes, where those documents will go, and to UCLA, and there'll be another set at the State Library in Sacramento and perhaps some other places. Yes?
Thank you, Mrs. Tick and Ray. And next, we're going to have Adjoa Ayatoro, Chair of the Legal Studies Commission and Chief Counsel, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America.
Thank you. I was sitting here thinking, I used to work with Angela Davis in the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression, and we'd come to rallies or panels, and she'd always be last, and she'd get up complaining because everybody said what she was supposed to say, what she was going to say. And I just want to say that, I enjoyed all of the presentations, and I feel like especially both Howard and my colleague in National Conference of Black Lawyers, Gerald, have really presented a lot of what I wanted to say. But as an avid advocate and a lawyer, I can always find more to say. So I want to first thank, of course, the organizers of this conference and this colloquium for inviting me to present at this conference. It is indeed an honor, and I accept that honor not simply on my own personal behalf, but on the behalf of the many, many thousands and millions one day of people who are really avid advocates for reparations for African descendants, and the millions that are really advocates for reparations for Africans and African descendants across the world, throughout the world. And I also want to speak really in the spirit, calling upon the ancestors, as we do many times in the African tradition, calling on the ancestors, but most particularly the ancestors that I think are related to this issue so very specifically are the ancestor Charles G. McIntyre, who wrote the book Criminalization of a Race, but was an advocate for reparations and so many other things in our community. The ancestor Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson, who I'll speak about a little bit in my presentation, who were, in fact, in the leadership of a reparations movement back in the late 1890s. My own personal ancestor who guides me among many, William Sherman Brabham, who was my grandfather. Shannara Gilbert and Haywood Burns, who were in the leadership of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, were very active in many of these issues, and most particularly to Haywood, who back in the, I would say in the late 80s and the very early 90s, was one of the strong persons who, when I was raising up reparations in the National Conference of Black Lawyers and really doing battle there to get our organization to found in Cobra, who spoke so eloquently and supported us so strongly, and with the respect that he had among most in our organization, because he was our founding director and had always been so strong a supporter, was very significant. You know, I want to start with really defining reparations, and Howard, in fact, used a quote that I was going to use from Lord Gifford in a paper that he presented on the legal basis for the claim for reparations. I want to summarize by saying that reparations is an international principle of remedy. And it's an international principle of remedy for peoples who, because of their peoplehood, have been injured, who've had their human rights violated, and in fact we can say have crimes against humanity committed against them. We've heard the examples throughout today, and most particularly from both Howard and Gerald, but we've heard the examples that were given, the Japanese Americans who were interned in what they would call the concentration camps here in the United States, the Jewish victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Many of us remember the political dissenters in Argentina, many of whom received reparations, and the families of the disappeared in Argentina who received reparations. Many of us have heard about the demands of the Japanese comfort women for reparations for what had happened to them. And we can talk about, Howard has talked extensively about the reparations that indigenous peoples in the United States have gotten, Canada and other places, for violations of treaty rights, that in many cases the return of land in addition to financial compensation. And so that we know that there is not only historic precedents for reparations, that this demand for reparations by African descendants and Africans, but we're speaking right now of African descendants in the United States, didn't just spring out of a vacuum, that it is in fact there is tremendous historic precedents. And as an earlier speaker said, I think in one of the, in the panel just previous to ours, but if not, an earlier speaker, said that in fact the demand for reparations became even more intense for African descendants after the Japanese Americans obtained reparations. The law actually passed in 1988. They actually got reparations in early 1990s. So that we understand that this is not just, you know, that we're not just talking about something that just, you know, it's just some creation of madness on the part of African and African descendants. The other thing is that, and it's very important to say, is that not only do we know that these are instances of reparations being given, but we really know that the United States government historically has been at the lead of demanding that countries who have violated the rights, most particularly of Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but then in the Kosovo incident, they came out saying we must have them pay reparations, that the United States government has been out there beaten the path for reparations for other peoples. In fact, I was appalled. I used to be, at one point in my history, I was the director of administration for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And, you know, one of the great things about the job, perhaps one of the only great things about the job, was the fact that tons of stuff come across your desk, because you're the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and they somehow get it confused with the Congressional Black Caucus, so you get a whole bunch of stuff. And what came across my desk one day was that there was a presentation at the State Department about the role that the United States was going to take in the Swiss bank issue for Jewish victims of the Nazi Holocaust. And so, you know, I say, wow, great, okay, I'm gonna go. Now, first of all, I was the only black face in there. And then, of course, everyone else in there, other than the person that was presenting, were white interns who worked at the State Department. And so I think that they thought this was just gonna be a congenial discussion, that they could just kind of say whatever they, wanted to say and educate these young folk. And so I'm sure as the person, and I'm blanking on the guy's name, I'm not blanking on it, I don't remember his name, was presenting, and I know that he kept looking at me with trepidation, wondering what the hell is going on here, And so after he made his presentation, I raised my hand, and he asked, after calling on a couple other little, white young interns, he finally had to call on me or really be called out, as really, totally ignoring the only black person in the room, and quite obviously the only person in the room other than him that was over 30. So, and I'm being generous. But the point being that I asked him, the question was, why is it that the United States government decided it was going to take the lead in demanding reparations for Jewish victims of the Holocaust against the Swiss banks? And of course, he went on and on and on and on and on and on and on about issues of human rights and, all of that kind of stuff. And he failed to recognize, because I didn't have to hand in my resume when I walked in the door, he failed to recognize that he was talking to a black woman activist lawyer. And all of those were very important ingredients in why he made the mistake of answering it in the incorrect way. Because he should have just said straight up, because of the vested interest of Jewish people within the government and power structure of the United States, we decided to do it, and then I would have shut up. Because that was the answer, and I would have shut up, right? And we would not have had the opportunity, of course, to educate all those young interns who was going to buy his stuff and not really understand the reason. And then, so I had to then raise my hand again, get ignored again, and finally get called on again and said, but why? I understand the human rights argument, but there are human rights violations here. Human rights violations against African descendants, human rights violations against Asians, human rights violations against indigenous peoples, human rights violations against Latinas. Why did the United States government, who is sitting on a bed of human rights violations, decide to address a human rights violation that did not even happen here? Why? So of course then he started talking about the pressure that was put on the United States government by the Jewish community, most particularly the lawsuits that were being filed, most particularly the banks in New York decided to go on strike. Once some of the banks in New York heard about the Swiss bank situation, they decided that they weren't going to do business anymore with the banks in Switzerland until this issue was reconciled. So that the economic as well as the social pressure that was put on the United States government led the United States government to take the lead, they say, and I'm sure there were other factors, and let's be real clear, and sending an official of the State Department, Eisenstadt, to actually participate and lead in those discussions and negotiations. So that it's important to understand, because what happens in the debate on reparations, and it happens in our communities, and I'm probably sure that I'm talking to those who already know this, but in the hopes that somehow if you don't, you will be educated, and if you do, you will repeat it to folk who don't know it, is that the United States has bought the concept of reparations lock, stock, and barrel for everybody except those victims that are most dearly connected to their violations of human rights. Now, that being said, y'all eating into my time, take that off my time. That being said, I was going to quote Lord Gifford, but I don't want to repeat the quote because you've already heard that quote. And I've kind of summarized it by saying what it is and the remedy that Lord Gifford talks about, which is the remedy of saying, how do we make these people whole? That's the remedy. The remedy of reparations is in real sense, and that has not been done in the Japanese-American case. And I dare say it probably has not been done in the Jewish victims of the Holocaust case in some ways, other than, of course, creating the state of Israel, which may in fact have been, how do we make these people whole? So I retract my prior statement. But that if we really look at how do we make these people whole, that is the concept of reparations, to repair, to heal. Now we know in the dialogue and debate in our communities who support reparations is the United States government cannot make us whole. What the United States government can do is to give us what is needed in order for us to make us whole. So, and that's an important distinction that, probably none of you realize the hours and hours of discussion and debate that went into this just small conclusion that I just made. But one of the things that I think that is important is Manny Marable wrote a piece in the beginning of this year, February 2002, called Reparations and Our Rendezvous with History. And it's real important in understanding what reparations is and where it will take us. And he talks about it from the concept of Malcolm X. And I raise this up because, see, people raise up Martin Luther King, which we should. I support us raising up Martin Luther King. But Malcolm X continues to be what to many people was kind of a renegade that we don't want to talk about. And part of that is because he raised it real clear, and he raised it real clear from the beginning in terms of what the differences were and what the real discussion was in the communities of African descendants in the United States. So what Manny says, and I quote, is indeed this was Malcolm X's greatest insight and gift to future generations of African American people. He changed the way black people thought about themselves. Malcolm moved us from being the footnotes in someone's history to becoming the key actors in the making of new history. Instead of singing someone else's song, we discovered the beauty of our own voices. Reparations thus becomes a way for us to challenge and to subvert the master narrative of white capitalist America and to testify to the truth of our own history. During colonialism, slavery, and segregation, people of African descent were diverted forcibly into the history of another people. To reclaim our birthright, we must emotionally and historically return to the sites of the original crimes and to speak on behalf of the victims who perished so long ago. Can we empower ourselves to bear witness on their behalf, to speak truth to power, to tell their untold stories embedded in fractured, fragmented memories long past? I suggest that in addition to this beautiful statement about what we need to do for our ancestors, we need to do it for ourselves. Because, see, the story for reparations is not simply a story about repairing us for what happened in 1865 and before. It is a story about repairing us for the consequences of slavery that continue to today. And that is said so eloquently by another person who I admire greatly, and that's A. Leon Higginbotham, who says in his book Shades of Freedom, which is the second volume after In the Matter of Color, that I believe there is a direct and tragic nexus between the false allegations and perceptions of today as we approach the end of the 20th century and some of the perceptions of black inferiority that have endured from the colonial period to the present. That also connects with the World Conference Against Racism documents. And many of us were there, well, I don't know about many of us here, but many of us were there in Durban, and we were there participating. I know one of the earliest speakers, Dr. Plummer, talked about the NGOs being observers, and I want to just make one small correction. We weren't observers. We were activists. We were in the faces of governments. We were in the faces. We were lobbying. We were having meetings with governments. We were actively aligning ourselves with with other NGOs who supported this issue. We aligned ourselves with governments who were very strong, such as Barbados, with the Africa group who led the charge for the language in the documents that dealt with reparations and dealt with the historic crimes of slavery and the slave trade. And in fact, as one of the African group members came and found us, we were in the back of the government building where the government meetings were being held, the NGOs and the African Descendant Caucus of the NGO groups, because we were deliberating and struggling because we understood that some of the Africa group were getting weak, and that they were kind of backing off on some of the language that they had agreed that they were going to support and push. In fact, that they had themselves, much of it had been created, and so we were strategizing back there, about a group of 30 or so of us, talking about what do we do, how do we go forward. And it was very historic because there were some of that group who had kind of chosen initially not to be active participants of the African Descendant Caucus, but to kind of work on their own. But in this crisis, we all came together, and we look up, and out comes one of the staff persons with the government delegations of one of the Africa group countries, saying, you've got to get back in there. You've got to get back in there because you're our backbone. Because when we see you, we feel strong. So that we were more than observers in that process. But the language that came out of in that document was not the language that if I had written it, or Howard had written it, or Gerald had written it, would have been there. It was a little milquetoast. It wasn't quite as decisive and bam, here it is, y'all, pay up. It wasn't quite that. But what it's very historic, and so we must claim this victory. And we have to claim it because what the document says, among other things, is the slave trade and slavery are crimes against humanity and should always have been so, especially the transatlantic slave trade. And that reparations are owed to the victims of those slave trades, which they identified as African descendants, Asian descendants, and indigenous peoples, for the continuing consequences of those slave trades. Not for something that happened to my great-great-grandfather, but for something that continues to happen to me. And that is why we have to push reparations, because we have to make it clear that we aren't just talking about a historic debt. We're not just talking about a debt that you owed back in 1865 that you haven't paid up on. We're not just talking about the unjust enrichment of this government and of the states that participated actively in it, and of the corporations that have been built on it. We're not just talking about disgorging that unjust enrichment because they gained it, they maintained it, and they held on to it, and it become rich on the backs of our ancestors. We're talking about reparations for the continuing violations that all too many of the speakers have spoken to. The beautiful and eloquent presentation of last night of the keynote speaker, and others have spoken to the continuing crimes that have their nexus with slavery, that are not disconnected from slavery. That we have to remember that when we talk about issues in healthcare, when we talk about issues of continuing discrimination in healthcare, I'm not talking about, blacks have more high blood pressure, but that's just their, what do they call it, lifestyle. They eat too much pork. You know what I'm saying? It's our lifestyle. We under too much stress. Stress of racism. How many black people can say that they are not afraid when they go into certain communities? How many black men can say that when they're driving, especially if they're driving that car we saw today, Howard, that Mercedes, and if they're driving that Mercedes, particularly in a white community, how many black people can say that they have not had the anxiety when they see a police car behind them? Are they going to stop me? You know, how many black men and women, not just men, see, many times we emphasize men, but it's not just black men, it's black women too. How many black people can say that when they go to healthcare facilities that they feel like they really have gotten the treatment that other people who are white have gotten? I have a friend that's with NCBL who is now a teacher, professor, I guess teacher's not the right word, professor in law school in West Virginia, and she has a white male friend of hers go to the doctor with her when she takes her child to the pediatrician, because she has noticed that when she goes as a black woman, that there's a certain way in which she is dismissed and her child is dismissed, but when her white male friend comes, there's a whole different treatment of respect. That's not in 1866. That's not in 1902. That is in 2002. There's a book, The American Dilemma in Health, that was just, the second volume was just released and one of the doctor's names is Clay. They're married, but they have two different last names. And what they talk about and what they identify as continuing vestiges of the slavery that deal with discrimination in the health system. They also talk about the fact that much of the health treatments for illnesses that predominantly or that disproportionately impact black people, the modalities for treatment have been verified. Is that 1 minute? Oh, Jesus. Have been verified on the white population, and have not been validated on the black population. The HIV studies, I don't know how many of you all saw in the newspaper yesterday, day before yesterday, predominantly the experimental treatments are given to white people. Now, in my 0 minutes that I have left, I would like, if I could, just have a wrap-up statement. Reparations is important for all the reasons that everyone has said has supported. One of the things that is critical is that we have to tell the history of this country. And the only way we really will tell it is through the process of reparations. Reparations is a process. It's not just an end result. And it will tell the story because, see, it will say, what one of the speakers said was that reparations, that slavery was localized in the United States. Well, I don't know if you mean localized to the whole of the United States, because that's where it was. Because we have evidence that New York had slavery until 1827, that Massachusetts had slavery up until the late 1700s, that Connecticut had slavery, that there's slavery, so that slavery was in the North as well as in the South, that we have evidence of these, that it eats into everywhere. So that as we talk about it, and I hope the questions will get to what can we do about it and what are we doing about it, as we look at it, we have to look at it as a national tragedy. And it's a national tragedy for which all of us are responsible. Those of us who are victims of it because of our ancestry, and those of us who, because of our ancestry, are in fact the benefactors of it, must come together and address it in as positive a way as possible. But reparations must be obtained, because otherwise there will be no peace in this country. What did they say? There will be no peace without justice. And reparations is a call for justice. Thank you.
We certainly are grateful and thank the contributions made by all of the panelists. And since there is no one who is assigned to make a commentary on the different presentations, we will open it up for questions from the audience. And I think there's someone who is there anyone passing out the microphone? So if you have a microphone, oh, they're being passed out. So Professor Daniels and the other person, will you hand someone the mic? That way I don't have to point to anyone. And you can please state who you're addressing your question to before you ask your question. and make sure the mic is on. Okay.
Not really addressing the question to anyone in particular. First of all, let me thank all the panelists for this fiery presentation that they've all made. One good thing in attending conferences of this type is the amount of learning that you engage in, and I've really learned so much listening to the presentations. But there is one critical area of the reparation discussion that I just want to touch on very briefly. Let me start with my difficulty in the area of specifically addressing individual firms, individual companies. I feel quite uncomfortable with that for a number of reasons, and I would therefore suggest, and this is really just a comment, I have been wrong before, and so if I'm wrong on this one, I wouldn't be surprised. So my suggestion is that the issue of reparation would be best approached in terms of macroeconomic analysis as opposed to microeconomic analysis. In other words, that we should be looking at the benefits that national economies, the economy of the United States, the economy of of Western Europe, and that kind of analysis, and therefore reparation should be something that governments, as opposed to individual firms or companies or human beings, are held responsible to pay. Now, apart from the methodological problem involving and identifying individual companies, as a scholar, I feel very uncomfortable with that as well. Much of the research I have conducted has been based on the documents that. This is very important for me. Let me just make it, please.
Okay.
Please. Much of the documents I have used in my research have been the documents of companies. As of the time I started my research in the 60s, it was very difficult to have these private records. And as of that time, the only thing these companies were worried about was the shame of being identified with the slave trade and slavery. Now, if in addition to the shame of being identified with the slave trade and slavery, there is now the fear of monetary costs involved in being identified with slave trade and slavery, what it will be for us who conduct research is that we will never have access to these private records again. So that's an aspect that worries me, apart from the methodological aspect of the whole thing. So I feel that it would be best to pursue a kind of national economy rather than the individual companies. I thank you.
Okay. But that was a question whether the macro strategy is preferable to the micro. I think I'm trying to get what your question is.
Yeah. No, okay.
I'll respond quickly. There really are two dimensions to this thing, and I don't think anyone will argue with the need for the macro analysis. But we're at a stage where, quite frankly, the only agenda is to focus public attention on this and to try to get a discourse going. And I think that those who've chosen to file suits against specific companies are interested in some aspects of the potential economic return from it. But I quite honestly believe that it's as much a part of a broader kind of strategic objective of bringing this thing to the public discourse. And believe me, when you touch people that have money, asking questions about the wherewithal of their money and where it's going, they do respond. Mm-hmm. They do respond, and respond in some very interesting ways. So I suspect that you're going to see a lot more suits directed at individuals and corporations and that kind of thing over the next period of time. But that's as work is going on, building the larger macro analysis that ultimately will, I believe, serve as the foundations for the real reparations claims.
Yeah, just briefly, if you recall, the anti-apartheid movement, it operated on two tracks, at least. One was the sanctions movement, which we were trying to pass a national legislation in Congress that would apply across the board. And the other was the divestment movement, which was much more decentralized, focusing on like the University of North Carolina, religious denominations, et cetera, which was decentralized and also allows for grassroots movement. So I don't think we necessarily need to counterpose one to the other, a decentralized, or micro versus macro, as you put it. Secondly, I think the discovery process in terms of filing lawsuits is going to disgorge a tidal wave of documents, so much that it will keep graduate students occupied into the next 2 centuries.
Is there any other panelist that wants to address that last question?
Can you hear me? Okay. My question is for the lawyers on the panel, which has to do with a sort of a legal and practical strategy, which is how do we go about defining a defendant? Because defining a defendant, because to establishing a defendant, because if it's a tort claim or an unjust enrichment claim based on contract law, then the idea is that there needs to be a defendant, and the defendant needs to be an ongoing entity. So I can understand, for example, how we could sue the crown heads of Europe, right, because the money from the slave trade is still in their hands. But how do you go about suing the U.S. government? And I've been wondering what strategies people have come up with for dealing with that, because that's the thing that keeps stumping me.
That's a good question, and what the question also includes implicitly is that there is the principle of procedural law that says that the United States is immune from suit except where the United States has decided it can be sued, which is sovereign immunity. One of the ways in which we do that in COBRA, and as well as the Reparations Coordinating Committee, of which I'm one of the co-coordinators, is looking at what are the areas of life, in fact, where we're saying are the vestiges of slavery, and then what agencies within the government are in fact responsible for maintaining the vestiges of slavery. That's no secret. That's what we do in 1983 actions all the time, is we don't sue the United States, but we do sue, you can sue the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or you can sue the Department of Health and Human Services, so that when we're looking at the vestiges of slavery, look at what is the agency of the United States or a state government that is responsible for maintaining that, and that would be how you would define the defendant. Who is responsible for continuing the harm, for creating the injury and continuing the harm, is how you identify a defendant. And once you figure that out, then that's who you sue.
And actually, crimes against humanity rest on international legal principles.
Right.
So therefore, there is The Hague. There's a whole lot of things, and I think I appreciate Gerald's commentary about the globalization of advocacy and so forth. But the point is that countries that do not have the military power that the United States has really have a great deal more respect for international law. And the question is, at what point do we engage those engines as well? And I think, I want to bring that up because I think that's an important engine, because if you go down into The Hague and you say, well, this is what we're going to raise these, someone's got to be, it's got to be, somebody's got to make some statements. Like, we have 1983, all these statutes in this country. But if the paradigm is subscribed to the system that created the legal apparatus, then you have to go outside of it. That's all I'm suggesting.
Well, the problem, and we wholeheartedly agree with you, but the problem on the legal sphere with suing in the International Court of Justice is that only a government, a state, they call it, which is government, national governments, can sue. So that you have to have a national government that will sue on your behalf. The second point is that in for example, the inter-American states of courts, an individual can sue, but they first have to exhaust the case within the government, within the state. So, for example, when we file, or the cases that have already been filed, let's say they lose and they go all the way up, they could then bring that same litigation in the Inter-America courts because they've exhausted. We could do the same with the litigation that we're going to file. One of the things, and I think that Gerald talked a lot about, was developing the relationships and understanding it's global, which is why I wanted to go into some of what we did in the World Conference Against Racism, because clearly that was a real alliance across national boundaries, and I think will be a good background and support for us as we go forward, that there may in fact be the opportunity of having a government or a state, as they call it, in the international arena, bring an action on behalf of African descendants in the Americas, not simply in the United States. But I think that's something that has to be developed as we continue in our work.
Is your question pertinent to the legal? I'm going to ask if you'll allow me to let Professor Finkelman, Dr. Finkelman, respond, because I think he wants to make a point that's related to.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on this, which it strikes me.
Is this related to the last discussion about
yes.
Okay, good.
Yes, it is. Is it on? Okay. It strikes me that there are a couple of other questions that arise. One of them is, although the modern international law is that the slave trade is a crime against humanity, in fact, every court in every jurisdiction that I know of in the 19th century, including, of course, the United States Supreme Court, held over and over again that slavery was not a violation of international law, nor was the African slave trade a violation of international law. And so it strikes me that there is at least some issue of retroactivity here that for people who are concerned about ongoing rule of law and legal structures issues should be a very profound issue, is that can we say today in the 21st century, well, what they did in the 19th century we know was a violation of international law, therefore we are going to declare it retroactively illegal, and we are now going to provide either a tort or a contract based on our 200-year later retroactivity change of the law. That's the first question. The second question, it also strikes me that there's a huge statute of limitations problem going on.
I'm sorry,
it strikes me that there's equally a huge statute of limitations going on problem. Now, obviously the U.S. government or any jurisdiction can pass legislation to waive a statute of limitations, but it strikes me that to use the courts as a mechanism for resolving this is not, in the end, perhaps the most productive way to go. I'm a historian teaching in a law school, and it seems to me that you cannot litigate history that is this old and, in fact, get what is at the heart of reparations, which is a repairing and a making whole through the court system. Our court systems, in particular, are not particularly good at making people whole. There may be an exchange of money, but people never feel very good about it after they've been in court, even if they win. So I wonder if in fact, this whole notion of, especially the retroactivity question, is not something that's a profound obstacle to the legal strategy approach.
Are you going to take
I can. First of all, your question makes the assumption that the basis of the claim is the crime against humanity and that's the legal action. And there are other theories that are not necessarily tied to crime against humanity. Number one, a theory that in fact the continuing vestiges of slavery violate the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and other amendments of the Constitution and other statutes. In addition, the same model we could look at in terms of Nuremberg and the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. In fact, Nazism was not a crime against humanity at the time that it was committed, and what they did was in Nuremberg is they made it retroactive to the beginning of the Nazi period, which is why they could argue, and they raised this in the World Conference Against Racism, that what they did, the United States response was, well, what they did was that they said all the individual acts were themselves crimes, and they were crimes against military law, and so that's how they got that package together. Well, all the acts that took place in the slave trade and slavery, the individual acts were still crimes at the time. Murder was a crime when the slave trade took place. Piracy on the high seas was a crime. So all of those things were crimes. The other thing is that I think the United States particularly, but its allies, Britain, Canada, was one of the strongest allies and advocates for the United States in these positions in the World Conference. What they failed to do is, when they raised the fact that it wasn't a crime against humanity then, is they dismiss all of the advocates who said that it was a crime against humanity then. Frederick Douglass, in his July 5th speech in 1852, was it? Talked about it as a crime against humanity. The courts in Europe talked about it as a crime against humanity. Not only, did they say that, this shouldn't happen anymore, but in the 1700s, internationally, they were beginning to say this is a crime against humanity.
The English courts did. The European courts did not say that. That's the problem. I don't want to get into a big technical.
Professor Finkelman.
Yeah.
I'm going to reluctantly.
Okay, that's fine. I don't mean to debate it, but.
I know. I'm going to reluctantly cut you off because there are a number of other people that want to ask questions.
Okay, I have a question that probably a couple different panelists might address.
I can't see the question. Could you stand, please?
Basing it partly, Professor Horn dealt with comparative models of the apartheid struggle, the civil rights movement, different things. My background is more in politics and movement kind of things. So we have, in those models, we have a collective psychology of public opinion building for support of things. We have a coalition of political power. In this movement of reparations, which I came to learn more about because this is a much further thing than you read in the pop culture and the newspapers, a number of questions arise. One, Professor Horn noted that 75% of the public opinion was against the Civil Rights Act. But at the time when it passed, there was a larger coalition of groups, labor, religious, all these groups that came into play. And that brought about, it didn't matter whether the people in the South, particularly the whites in the South who had the vote, they didn't want it. The federal registrars had to come in there, but it was a larger coalition. Secondly, in Illinois, I think it was more the scientific evidence that proved that some of these people on death row were obviously innocent, and so many that governor's heart said, you know what, I can't keep killing innocent people. More than any, I think it was the scientific evidence that changed it. I may be wrong. Related to prisons, I understand from talking to other Professor Horn that the group doing legal things is talking about the prison industry, the growth, the calculated growth, the political power of the lobbyists, of the prison guards, and within the reparations issue, that's the community that has not been benefited by other compensatory things. And he was talking about lawsuits relating to prison labor, which is almost slavery. And it's such a growth industry. So I want to know if that lawsuit is in the works. In addition, in terms of international things, I would hope there is not
please focus your question.
Okay, for Professor Horn, a requisite correlation with Palestinian lands, because from the book Time Immemorial, The Origins of the Conflict, it is not given that land there. I don't see any need to connect these two things. People can do that. I don't see the need to do it. In terms of Malcolm X, and this will be my final point, I'd like to talk some personal things later with people. I think there were two visions that I came out of in the civil rights movement, and I think both King and Malcolm X were moving towards each other at the times of each of their deaths. I think those of us in the movement hope there would be a new history created.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off because I don't hear a question.
I just want to finish.
I'm going to give you 30 more seconds.
No,
if I don't feel a
how about 30
question,
seconds?
I'm going to pull the plug. I'm going to give you 30 more seconds.
Fine, that's all I
If I don't hear a
need.
question,
Okay.
I'm pulling the plug.
Okay, 30 seconds. That there was a new history created of what Dr. King called the beloved community and a new humanity. Or you could have an alternative view that began a period of mirror image racial identity.
Okay, I'm pulling the plug.
Yeah, well, thank you for those very stimulating questions. One of the reasons that I've suggested an international strategy, and of course this is not meant to denigrate a domestic strategy, but many people deal with that. So in my 20 minutes I chose to focus on the global because I don't think that's dealt with enough, in part to get away from this sort of national solipsism, this delusion that whatever a scant majority in this 275 million strong nation believes, then that's it and that's the end of the story, when of course history really doesn't work that way. I didn't say that 75% of the people were against the Civil Rights Act. I said that according to certain polls, something like 75% of those in the United States are opposed to reparations. What I had suggested was that perhaps a majority of those who were able to vote in the South in the mid-1960s may have been against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But that really just underscores my point, because the point was, of course, is don't be limited to the majority that had the right to vote in the South in 1965. Just don't be limited to the majority of the 275 million who have the right to vote in the United States in 2002. That this is a global question and should be dealt with as such. With regard to Illinois, it's not only what the governor did with regard to the Innocence Project at Northwestern, but also the fact that there were German nationals on death row in Virginia, German and Canadian nationals on death row in Virginia and Arizona. And many of these individuals were deprived of consular consultation before having to go to court. And it's that legal issue that the Germans in particular, and the Canadians to a certain degree, have been hammering home on Washington to some effect. And that is having ripple effects with regard to the entire anti-death penalty struggle. Now, my colleague Adjoa deals on a regular basis with prisoners' lawsuits and prisoners' rights, and perhaps she can address that particular point. But in any case, I think we need to recognize that, for example, just to close out, that on August 1963, when you had the March on Washington, Dr. King, and all of that, it's important to recognize that there were demonstrations globally at U.S. consulates and embassies all across the world. And that if you look at the State Department records, you will find evidence of this, and you will find a lot of hand-wringing and anxiety being generated about these global demonstrations, just like there was hand-wringing in Washington and anxiety being demonstrated about the 250,000 who showed up in Washington, D.C. And to only look at one and not look at the other is ahistorical, it's misleading, it's misguided, and it doesn't get us anywhere in terms of 2002 going forward.
There is one of the areas in which we are looking in terms of a lawsuit is the criminal punishment area, is a continuing vestige of slavery, and most particularly in the criminal punishment area, we can see virtually an unbroken chain from the black codes, slave codes to the black codes, all the way up till today. The whole issue of disparate punishments, not just disparate, the fact that white people weren't punished for this, similar behavior that black people were punished for, or that they got a far less severe punishment from the death penalty on down. I mean, and there were recent studies in the past number of years on the death penalty that showed that, and I think Gerald, in fact, mentioned some of the data from them, that in fact, and we say similarly situated because it's like same background in terms of criminal charges and all of that, that a black man is more likely to get the death penalty than a white man, even though their situations are similar, and it most particularly is more likely to get it if the victim is white. So that devalues both. It devalues the life of the perpetrator of the crime as well as the victim of the crime, the black victim of the crime. And that's not to say, and I always say, when I give that statistic that I don't support the death penalty, but it's to show the continuing vestige, which A. Leon Higginbotham talked a lot about in his book, In a Matter of Color. Shashi McIntyre talked about it in Criminalization of a Race. Incarceration and all of that, you can show the disproportionate figures. And it's interesting that the disproportionality of incarceration did not occur until after the end of slavery, to after the end of the Reconstruction, when prisons started coming up, initially in the movement around the Quakers was to have prisons have the solitary confinement, and in fact it was more white people were in prison at that time. But once the end of that period when lynching was rampant and all of that, and began to utilize the punishment system for black people as well as white people, then you began to see the slowly increasing disproportionality in the use of prisons for black people.
Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom after a while. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.